My background is originally in biology, but over the years I realized, just like Ian, that many of the models we develop can also be applied to human behavior. And so we started looking at what humans do in the wild, and very often they break rules. And this is the topic of my talk today. I believe that collective rule breaking is one of the big topics of our times. You see examples here of the storming of the Capitol in 21, the riots in France by the Yellow Jackets, and the sort of little everyday rule breaks that more or less all people engage in. You can also think of looting of shops, of all the COVID and Corona demonstrations, and the almost weekly collective violence during sports events. We come to that. Currently, I work with 3 people on this topic. Anna Nassauer, a microsociologist, Pavel Romanchuk, a theoretician, and Marcel Brass, who is a cognitive psychologist. And we are particularly interested in the role of social influence in these types of events where a person or a small number of people break a rule to start with, and they have social influence on others who witness this rule break and are heavily socially influenced and very often follow. Now, this usually happens in public, in physical space, so it's not so much an internet event. It's really what we witness in public spaces, and very often it also costs human lives. It's important to mention that these are situations where usually everybody is aware of what the rule or the law is, and the validity of that rule is on a different time scale from the social process that can momentarily undermine it. We usually study this by tracking the behaviors and movements of large numbers of people in public situations. And I left this last one here with a question mark. Is collective rule breaking good or bad? I think it depends very much on the context. Initially, I said these can be big problems in society, but they can also have positive effects, these events, if you think of rule breaks in dictatorships or recent examples of civic disobedience in the context of climate demonstrations. So I'll leave it up to you how you think of that. So let me go back to an old experiment we did quite a number of years back with a PhD student, Jolyon Faria. We were interested in how people jaywalk, how they cross a road against a red light. This is here outside the main train station in Leeds in the UK. And we wanted to know, when the first person crosses, will the next person cross independently of this, or is there local social influence that would be typical of collective behavior? And in the first instance, you would see a wave-like structure, sort of an independent event like here. First person crosses and the next person can be any of them. If it's collective, you usually see a wave formation. Now, we applied a few controls here for various aspects of this crossing behavior. I won't go into this, but it allows us essentially not only to demonstrate that this is indeed triggered by local influence, so the observed behavior is significantly different from the random expectation here, but we could also model how strong the social influence is on the local neighbors. And it increases the starting probability of a person by a factor 2. Now, at the time, I found this deeply satisfying. I mean, that I could explain sort of who the next people are who will cross in such a situation and endanger their lives. In filming this, we witnessed quite a number of events where people made contact with cars for the simple reason that when people always keep copying what others do, the initial gap in the traffic can be long gone, and the next cars are coming and people are still crossing. And this is the danger of this type of collective behavior, that people don't monitor the situation on their own. Now, as I mentioned, I filmed this for many weeks. I got interesting information about the comings and goings also of my colleagues at the main train station. People who claimed they worked very hard often came late, left early. So there was an interesting side effect. But when we finished and I walked back to the university with my PhD student, we stopped at a red light ourselves. I was talking to him, somebody next to me started walking. I followed and I nearly got hit by a car myself. And this is when I realized, okay, I mean, after filming this, after modeling it, and after believing that I understand all of this, there are obviously still gaps. And some of these were filled by Marcel Brass, a colleague of mine in cognitive psychology. And he pointed out to me that basically what I had done in the model, this is very weak here. I had basically taken care of this second mechanism here for social contagion by measuring the social pull. And he pointed out that there are important other mechanisms that can be at play that also have a strong influence. One of them is this one here, the influence of the group on perceptual and attentional processes. And this can bias the way in which humans sample their environment visually. And one example is gaze following. Another influence that the group can have is comes from cognitive neuroscience. So people actually experience it as rewarding when they conform, and the opposite if they diverge from what others do. And I give you an example here from Marcel's work. So he showed a person, well, first of all, he instructed people to show a certain hand movement on instruction. And while they were doing this, they would see a video screen in front of them where 1 up to 4 people were either showing the expected hand movement or a different one. And this has a surprisingly strong effect on the response times of people. So if they show a congruent behavior to that viewed on the screen, their response times are shorter than when they see a person doing something different on the screen. And as many more people do it, their response times become shorter. And you see considerably longer response times that increase with a number of people showing this divergent behavior, because there is a delay in the brain when you see a conflict to what you are about to do yourself, because it activates regions in the brain for the other behavior that you want to copy but shouldn't if you keep to the rule that you were instructed with. So, I mean, this I thought showed a nice example of insights into the actual cognitive processes in the brain underlying simple rule breaking in the lab. And the question is, of course, can we use this to improve our understanding of processes on larger social scales? Now, I wish I could go back to this original experiment and do it much better with the understanding that I have now from cognitive psychology. And maybe I will indeed do it one day, but we now can see that there is a whole range of contexts to which this kind of problem applies. And my postdoc, William Arledge, is in the process of studying this. So in the field of conservation biology, this is not known as collective rule breaking, but collective non-compliance. So if people go off path in a national park, if they fish in a no-take zone, or if they take bycatch, that they should actually return to the ocean. And in all of these, we see very strong elements of social influence where rule breakers modify the behavior of others in unwanted ways, massively undermining international conservation efforts. And the way that William is planning to study this, so he wants to stage simple experiments where people witness rule breaking. In this case, for example, fishing is forbidden here, and they experimentally stage these kind of behaviors. This would be an example of direct social influence. And down here we have one of indirect social influence where people have littered. People see the evidence of this without actually witnessing people in the act, but this can modify then their attitude and their behavior when it comes to the consequences of their own behavior. Now, and this brings me to a Helbing classic from the 90s when Dirk was in the prime of his youth, because he modeled an aspect of human behavior that I found really interesting in the context of collective rule breaking. And it also concerns these indirect effects because Dirk modeled at the time when new illegal pathways emerge in public paths, and we could think more broadly of this also in national parks or any protected environment. So this kind of behavior is unwanted, that people create here these additional pathways. And Dirk predicted that they would emerge if there is a 20% or bigger gain for taking the direct route. And I think this is really beautiful work, which takes on a new meaning when viewed through the lens of collective rule breaking, because the question emerges now, does the existence of these paths really bias the behavior of those people who come along, and how strongly when they come under indirect social influence? Nowadays, we can do many of these experiments in VR, and Ian already gave some beautiful examples of the use of VR. We are also making heavily use with Marcel Brass of this technique, because as you can imagine, many rule breaks that endanger human lives are not the kind of thing we can experimentally carry out. I have very many undergraduates still. I would hate to waste some lives just for gaining additional insight. So we need to do this here in protected environments where people can safely break rules, even when it comes to riots or collective violence. Now, and I've shown you so far social influence experimentally only in these very small groups. Let's look at larger groups, and this again goes back in time to an experiment that we carried out in collaboration with Ian and with Dirk on larger human crowds, initially starting with a small group. We instructed people to walk in an arena at normal speed. They are meant to remain within arm's length of each other to have some social cohesion. They're not allowed to talk or gesture. And then you have one person that is meant to pursue a particular direction in this arena, but without leaving the group. And it's not easy to reach that target. You need to take the others along, but you can't say to them, come with me, or gesture. You need to do it indirectly. And it turns out that people are very good at doing this. And we did this on a bigger spatial scale because we wanted to know how many people does it actually take to move a bigger crowd. And the answer was for 200 naive people, it takes about 5%. 10 leaders, they don't know of each other. Each one of them is just following the rule to walk in a particular direction. And these 10 were sufficient to move the group in a particular direction. Now, then, as a biologist, you always want to see a control, of course. What happens if we have no leaders in the group and we found the self-emergency of these ring structures? You get a torus, and if the density is high enough, then you actually get lane formation in this as well. And this is again where we could use insights from Dirk's work on these densities that are required for this kind of thing. Because for me, this was a new area to work on humans at the time. Now, if we look at conflict and people walk in opposite, or the leaders are meant to go in opposite directions, 10 in one direction, 20 in the other, we find that this can usually be resolved with all of them ending up at the majority target, all 200. It takes a little while, they oscillate a little, but they eventually settle. So I mentioned already we did these experiments because we wanted to know what kind of quorums are required for moving large human groups. We were very curious whether we can actually predict human behavior in situations that are very similar to real life in public spaces. And the answer is yes, we can do that. And we found that individual variation was not so important. It didn't really depend on which 10 or 20 people we picked for these experiments. It's really more or less a numbers game. It helped a little if you take tall people, but the influence of that was weak. Now, the question is, can we actually apply these types of models to situations where humans break serious rules? And we don't know yet. And we also don't know much about the role of the other cognitive mechanisms in these very large groups beyond motor contagion. And the big question is, are our models even good enough to make these kind of predictions for collective rule breaking? And Ian has already given some fascinating insights for why the old collective behavior models take some revision anyway. And I want to make a case for some specific things we would like to know about collective patterns and about some aspects that we may need to consider here. So first of all, very little is known about the dynamics of human crowds when it comes to collective violence. We don't know whether it develops, whether it spreads linearly or exponentially. And the consequences for interventions are, of course, massive. I mean, if the security forces only have a very limited time until a quorum is reached and then things get out of control, it's the kind of thing you would really like to know. And it's surprising how little studied it is. We should also really know whether these quorum thresholds are related to the severity of the rule break. So, I mean, my prediction would be for people to attack the police, this would probably require a larger quorum than to follow somebody across a road against a red light. But again, the answer is we don't really know yet. Similar situation applies to the escalation of rule breaking. Sociologists have done some beautiful work on how people apparently start with territorial invasions when they have other demonstrators opposing them or the police. Then usually property damage follows, and finally physical violence is the last step of escalation. But we don't know whether the quorums for each of these behaviors, whether they influence each other. And if you have reached one, whether this reduces the quorum for the next. And why should we expect this? Partly because of the strong role of emotions in these situations. So once people are in a raised emotional state, inhibitions go down and they are more willing or ready to engage in severe forms of collective violence. I mentioned already that we know very little about the relative contribution of other cognitive mechanisms in these situations, and the same applies to the existence of the network topologies that help us to predict the speed of the dynamics and also give us an understanding of the number of people who actually become involved. And this is an interesting aspect, because when you look at violent crowds, or even at people at war, where it's legal or permissive, so to say, to use violence and even kill, it is surprising how few people actually then engage in violence, even in a wartime situation. So we know from some work in sociology that there is a very strong situational effect on people, so a very strong context effect in which people begin to be violent, and it is surprisingly much less triggered by any kind of predisposition. And the police still categorizes people as, I think they call it, they are willing to commit violence, and then a higher level is they seek to engage in violence. And these types of predispositions are actually not very good predictors. Even those who seek violence will often not actually commit acts of violence, because they need a situational factor that actually allows them to feel, now I can really do this. And I found this quite surprising, because it tells us that there are additional elements in this behavior that we don't understand very well. Yeah, I mean, just to finish up, as a biologist, our community has often taken inspiration from economics, psychology, sociology to understand various aspects of animal behavior better. And I think it's an important time now to do the opposite and to study humans as if they were animals. It's not very popular with a lot of psychologists and sociologists, who always argue for more complexity in the behavior, but I think sometimes the opposite is needed, and we need to strip down psychological and sociological models to the absolute essentials to see what gives predictive power. But here I'm probably preaching to the converted. In other fields, this is very controversial, actually, to take a reductionist approach at human behavior. Yeah, and finally, I strongly believe that we can only predict what happens in collective rule breaking in small groups and in large crowds on the basis of cognitive processes that happen in the brains of individuals. I think this is absolutely essential to make predictions at these higher levels, and we need to incorporate the mechanisms that we find here into the models to have a chance of scaling up to society relevant processes. And with this, I thank you for your attention.